So I'm here recording with Ian. He is a Substack writer. I think he has a very unique perspective that's different from most people in that he, at one point in the past, was writing for American Renaissance, associated with Jared Taylor. He defended the hereditarian position. He's not himself a scientist, but he found an interest in these topics. And then a number of years later now, he has rebuked that former position. He's come out against it. And, again, still not, neither of us are professional geneticists here, so we are not experts in the field that you should take us as the word of God or the word of the experts. But, he follows people now like Sasha Gusev who've come out pretty strongly and has had some interesting articles on that. So I just wanted to ask you, before we get into maybe the details of the arguments of why you changed that position from a logical standpoint, I guess tell me a little bit about personally what that was like. And again, we're talking about 2010, which for a lot of people in the fast-paced world we live in is like ancient history. But can you take us back to that time? What were you thinking? What, in your life, what were sort of the motivations that you think in terms of your personality or your life experience? What sort of drew you into that? And then when did that begin to change?
Right. So we have to go back even further than 2010, all the way back to 2000, at which point I was a PhD student in comparative literature and was not happy in that position, mostly because I had a very scientific outlook, and that contrasted markedly with the outlook of most of the people around me, who were postmodernists, Foucauldians, who thought that science didn't tell anyone about the truth. It was always a way of controlling people, right? And so I was unhappy for that reason. I also had rather serious mental health problems, right? And I was later diagnosed as schizotypal, which is sort of a mild form of schizophrenia. And for these reasons was not really able to participate in a professional community as an adult, right? And I think what happened to me is what happened to a lot of young people and young men back then who were having trouble adjusting to the world, is that, we got into, Charles Murray and decided, the reason I'm having all these troubles is that I'm a brave truth teller and all the people around me are deluded. And so I, embraced that kind of identity very enthusiastically and read the bell curve and want to talk about it with everyone, and eventually started writing. Well, I got involved in the before the American Renaissance website, we had the listservs. I don't know if you know what a listserv is. There's just email groups that exchange information, and I got heavily involved in that. And Jared Taylor asked me to write for the magazine, and I did. And in the last part of 2002, he hired me, and so I moved down to Oakton, Virginia, and started working for American Renaissance. And I knew nothing about web design, and he said, "Well, we need to upgrade our website," which was very much Web 1.0, or more like actually Web 0.0. And I said, "Hey, there's this thing called movable type where we can publish articles and people can comment on them and we can moderate them." And so I learned about that, and I reworked the whole American Renaissance website, and so that it was we could post news articles and people could discuss them, and that was extremely popular. There were a lot of very, very popular race realist or racist, I would say now, white nationalist websites, including ours and Stormfront and various others. We were a bit different from Stormfront in that we just didn't allow anyone to talk about Jews, right? We decided we just didn't want to hear about that. From our perspective, we were going to say Jews were white people, and that suppression of commentary on that subject never ceased to dog us, and we were often ridiculed for it, and but I think we did attract a different type of reader. A lot of them were Jewish, and eventually that Jewish issue became the major reason why I left American Renaissance, because I was always appalled by neo-Nazis. I was always appalled by Holocaust deniers. I considered myself a reasonable person, and I did not consider Holocaust denial to be a reasonable belief. And I and a number of other subscribers wanted Jerry Taylor to address this issue, and so they sent him a letter in which I participated anonymously, and he got really mad about the letter, and so it was in that context that I ended up leaving American Renaissance, and I kind of quit. I was kind of fired, and after that, I ran a couple of my own websites, trying to present a sort of what I consider a more rational view of race, without the Holocaust denial and all that stuff. And eventually, so we're at the year 2006 here now when I started those websites, and I did that for about 4 years, and eventually just kind of got sick of it, which was kind of a sign that my mental health problems were ebbing, because I was 40 years old then, and your brain chemistry starts to change, and I just decided that I didn't want to do this stuff anymore, and so I stopped doing it, and I didn't think about race for a while, and thought about it for a couple of years, and after a couple of years, I thought, wow, a lot of the stuff I was saying back then wasn't really true, and I also wanted to get a job, and my name was very associated with this stuff. I thought it might be an impediment. And so I did an interview with the Southern Poverty Law Center in which I discussed a lot of the stuff I've been talking with you about. And then I didn't think about race until really, I guess, last year. And I had all these writing projects, but I really couldn't put anything together. I couldn't figure out who I was. And finally this year, I sort of, I discovered Substack, and I've been able to put together some new articles. And the first article I wrote was again about my view of race, and I started to read up about it. And I read a lot of the critics of race realism, which I really hadn't done much of before, including James Flynn, who wrote a book called "What Is Intelligence Against the Strong Hereditarian Position on IQ," and then I started reading about contemporary population genetics, starting to try to understand it, and I now see that the old ideas that I was working with about heritability and what was innate and what was environmental is completely obsolete, and there's a new way of studying these things that has resulted from the mapping of the genome, where people associate genetic variances with phenotypic traits. And those have universally found the heritability of IQ, that is the extent to which it's determined by your genotype, to be extremely low. They don't quite know how low yet. But I hope you'll put in a link to to this Sasha Gusev article called "No Intelligence is Not Like Height," which is why it was about how contemporary population genetics has discovered that height really is a strongly heritable trait that's heavily determined by our genotype, but intelligence really isn't. The contemporary heritability estimate for intelligence is 2 to 5%, right? From contemporary population genetics, which means that virtually none of it is determined by our genome. There are various ways of estimating what the total possible heritability of IQ is, and it's somewhere around 15%. That is, that 15% probably includes a lot of environmental factors, but that's the maximum that we can expect of the maximum percentage of our IQ that of variation in the IQ that the genome determines, right? And so intelligence is really not at all like height. It isn't. And so back when I started, when I was reading about these issues back in the 90s, the Bell Curve and various other books a lot like it, like Arthur Jensen's The G Factor and J.P. Rushton's Race, Evolution, and Behavior. And they said that IQ was 80% heritable or more, which means it's virtually entirely determined by our genes, and there's very little we can do to change it in our lives. And since there were IQ gaps between blacks and whites, they thought, well, those aren't really likely to go away. And I believed in that stuff. There's a lot of people who still believe in that stuff, and it turns out just not to be true, which is kind of great. It means that we no longer have to be racist, right? There's no reason to be a racist anymore. There's no scientific justification for it. I'll put it that way.
Right. Yeah, and I think you're hitting on maybe a division here that you mentioned as far as Judaism or Jewish people, anti-Semitism at American Renaissance. There was this very awkward, contentious internal struggle over how are we, as you said, presenting ourselves as purely scientific. We just stick to the facts. We just read the research and we're truth tellers. And yet, at the same time, there was this Jewish issue that was dogging people that, Jared Taylor always maintained, Jews are more intelligent. So from a pro-intelligence perspective, we should even like Jews more. But for some reason, these views, these race realist views, were always associated with anti-Semitism, even when you were actively moderating and trying to stamp that out. It was still following you. And do you have any theories about what is the link between those things?
Well, I mean, it's kind of the big Nazi narrative, right? That our position was that the people in power, the media, are lying to us about race, right? So why would they do that? Why would they lie? And the explanation that seemed to convince most people was that the media was in the control of the Jews, and the Jews wanted to destroy white people, right? And if you read David Duke, for example, the Jews use blacks as a weapon against white people, right? And they encourage anti-racism in order to undermine our solidarity and identity and power as a people, right? And that is a lot like the same thing that Hitler was saying. It's a sort of outdated version of that whole narrative. And so the whole Jewish thing served as a kind of explanation for why we were in the situation that we were in, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a crucial point that in if people don't understand why elites in the media are anti-racist, if they don't understand that history, then well, they need an explanation and they're going to come up with something, whether it's a right explanation or a wrong explanation. And I think there's this phrase that I use called red pilling Bill Gates, and I think there's this fantasy among the types of people you're describing where they think that if you could somehow present enough empirical evidence to Bill Gates on race realism or from a Sasha Gusev perspective, it would be you would fool him, you would trick him into saying, well, here's what Rushton and Jensen say, and they're authoritative, and so on. That somehow Bill Gates would just become a far right fascist or something, or he would agree with Jared Taylor. And my contention is that even when race realism was much more popular, or we'll just say racism, it was more popular in our country in the 1940s and the 1950s. There were still elite decisions made in the FDR administration and the Supreme Court justices that he appointed that they were opposed to segregation. And so understanding why they were opposed to segregation, and the Supreme Court justices, one was Jewish, Felix Frankfurter, but most of them were not. And so trying to figure out historically why did they make that decision, even at a point in American history where the vast majority of white people were really racist. I mean, people were against interracial marriage. 90% of people were opposed to interracial marriage. That has changed very quickly after civil rights. And I think that's an effective top-down change, that because the law changed and because the media changed from the top down, then that had a bottom, effect on the rest of the people in the country. But I think not being able to confront that fact, why did FDR make those decisions? Why did those Supreme Court justices just saying it was the Jews is almost a necessary excuse if you don't want to acknowledge that these were white elites who were intelligent, they were well informed, they were aware of racist arguments at the time, and they decided to make a different decision. So actually granting white people the agency that they had the ability to make decisions and they weren't tricked by the Jews or controlled by the Jews, I almost feel like I'm on the other side of defending white people and saying they're not that dumb, don't count out FDR, don't call him a big dummy or whatever, or whatever the claim is. That is something that I try to communicate to people, that let's scrutinize the reasons why that change happened, and try to understand them objectively, historically, use some evidence. But I want to go back a little bit and just clarify the timeline here. So you mentioned you were a PhD student, early 2000s. At some point, you connected with Jared Taylor, and then you started working on the website, and then you were fired/quit. What were the kind of those in between? Was that 2006 to 2010? What was that time frame?
I worked there from the end of 2002 to the middle of 2006, and I moved down to Oakton to where New Century Foundation is, which is Jared Taylor's basement. I mean, it might have changed. I got my PhD in the summer of 2002, and then moved down to Oakton, and left in 2006. And then between 2006 and 2010, I ran my own racist websites.
And how old were you when you encountered the work of people like Rushton in the early 2000s?
It's a good question. So Bell Curve comes out in 1994. I was a Democrat. I had been raised by liberal to leftist parents, and so I was just shocked by the whole idea and refused to think about it. And then there started to be conservatives who said this is actually really good and makes a lot of sense. It's an incredibly good book. I mean, it's wrong, but it's very well written and very convincing when you read it without any further information. And so and most of my colleagues in comparative literature were also liberal to leftists. And when I started getting mad at them, I wanted to say, well, to hell with these people. And so I read the bell curve, and yeah, it's all right, and you guys are a bunch of liberal. What was the word I used? Well, you guys are a bunch of liars and shakedown artists. Where we used to use a lot back then, and so and that would have been towards the late 90s. Actually I remember reading the bell curve itself in the year 2000.
And so graduating or being an early PhD student, would that be like 24, 26 at the time?
So in the year 2000, I was 30, and so I got my PhD in 2002 when I was 32, and basically did the racist stuff until I was 40.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit interested in. I mean, you say that you kind of put your name out there and you felt that that might have hurt some employment aspects. You also had this leftist family. Could you describe kind of what that was? Were your family aware of your views? How did that affect you?
Oh yeah, they were definitely aware of my views. I would not stop talking about my views, and and it made for some pretty tense times with my whole family. And it's to the credit of my mother and father that they maintained a relationship with me, because I could very well have abandoned them. But they always, my mother especially always listened to me and presented another side, and supported me, and so I did maintain those relationships. The relationships with some of my uncles and cousins kind of ended at that point, but um, and there were a lot of there was a lot of conflict because I was always talking about this stuff, but we did manage to iron things over, I guess, smooth things over. Um,
Do you feel like, I would use kind of COVID as an example of something where there was a very harsh polarization. Some people were saying, the vaccine it's a Bill Gates genocide plan to kill everybody, and other people were saying, well, if you don't take the vaccine, you're basically inadvertently killing people who are, compromised immune systems. And so on both sides, there was this very, tense mood. And I noticed that within families, people wouldn't come to Thanksgiving, or people would sort of split apart. And even years later, where I think that issue is less contentious, or people just don't care so much about COVID vaccines because it's not as relevant, that pain and that separation which occurred, even though the particular issue that ignited it is gone or not as prevalent, the separation remains, that families remain split apart. And do you feel like you were successfully able to overcome that, or is there still lingering effects?
So I don't see most of my family, and that is partly due to the pain of that conflict, but it's partly just selfishness on my part. That is I there's a lot of people in my family that I never really got along with. I never really enjoyed their company, and they have a lot of problems, and I'm really glad I'm not involved in those. So it's actually kind of selfish on my part, and unlike a lot of people, I do not idealize families. I think a lot of people will say family is the most important thing. You've got to keep in touch with your family, and I'm really not so sure about that. I think families have a lot of effects for good, and also for ill, and maybe that argument you have about COVID may be exposing some basic fault line between you and your family, and it may be your way of becoming aware that, hey, these people aren't good for me, and I should just do my own thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I presented sort of this causality that it's that you have this perfect harmonious family and then a political issue comes along and destroys the harmony of the family. But it sounds like what you're saying is that oftentimes people have underlying resentments built up, and then there are these trigger points and these excuses and justifications of like, well, it's hard for me to dissociate from my sister-in-law because I don't like her as a person, but now that COVID has come along, I can kind of use that as a wedge to say, you know what, I can't deal with these crazy conspiracy theorists or whatever it is. And so, taking that point to its logical conclusion, you spoke before about how you felt alienated, maybe on a personal level, before there was any ideology. You felt alienated from your colleagues in academia, and you almost viewed race realism as a wedge that you could kind of get revenge against them or feel a sense of moral superiority. Like, you guys are these hucksters and you're selling these lies, but I'm a good person, I'm a moral person. This is sort of like a good versus evil, instead of like, maybe I just don't fit into this particular environment.
Yes, and so that's right. The racism functioned as a way of expressing my anger towards them, and that anger wasn't primarily about race. It was about a bunch of stuff that I couldn't really explain or articulate, and part of that was my own deep problems with dealing with people, which I was very afraid of, and I didn't like to look at that part of myself, and so yeah, and I think racism actually functions in that way. It's when you say, well, I'm a race realist. I believe the science about race, which says that there are these gaps, and that when you do that, you aren't talking entirely or even mostly about race. You're saying, I'm very angry at you, and I'm very angry at the world we live in, right? And I'm using this to express my anger. And the other thing is, I'm an original thinker, right? I think for my own. I don't accept the commonplaces and dominant viewpoints of my society because I'm an independent thinker, and so racism isn't just about race, maybe not even primarily. It's a way of building an identity, a positive identity for yourself. It's about expressing anger and all these different kinds of things.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think the reason why Jared Taylor was thought to be so successful is because he comes off as not an angry person, as opposed to the vast majority of people where there is this sense of a passive aggression of somebody trying to, rather than openly say, hey, I don't like you, or I'm angry at the world, to because there's an inability, or like you said, there's a fear of confronting unpleasant emotions. Instead, you can say, well, I'm really only upset because of this technical, political, racial issue. I'm not upset because I don't get along with people, or they don't understand me, or I don't fit in, or something like that. And I want to bring it also back to what I had asked you earlier, which is, why are people who are interested in race realism also interested in anti-Semitism? And going with this explanation that these are actually defensive and in their own way constructive ideological mechanisms, that they serve a purpose in defending a person from this feeling that they don't belong. They say, well, it's not my fault that I don't belong. It's this ideology that is causing this dissonance. If we got rid of this ideology, then I could finally be happy. Then I could finally fit in with my people. And that's an interesting phrase, my people, because obviously race realists, white nationalists, they'll use that term to say like, well, we're all white people and we would all just be happy together in a united government if it wasn't for these Jews or if it wasn't for these liberals or something. And that fantasy is, I think it's obviously wrong, but I think it serves a purpose in that it gives people hope of this utopian paradise where people really do get along, where people really do say, well, we both have European ancestry and we're all brothers and no more brothers wars and we're going to get together. I mean, there is as much as it is negative and it is hateful, but there is an attempt at love. I think that is the fundamental human desire undergirding these extreme ideologies is people want to be loved. And in fact, when you have people on the left who say, well, these people are evil monsters and they deserve to be cast aside and excluded from society. I mean, I understand that approach, but also the impact of that is to make people dig further into the ideology, because the more you reject somebody who wants love and is delving into extremism, the more you reject them, the more they're going to dig their heels into, well, see, this is just proof of the Jews are attacking me, and this is proof that the liberals are destroying society, and they're just going to go further into that. And I would also say, maybe add that there's a book, or not a book, I'm sorry, there's a movie called The Believer, and it's about a self-hating Jewish person who gets into neo-Nazism. And there's a line in that movie where he says that Judaism, in a sense, needs anti-Semitism to survive, because sort of the more that you attack Jews and you blame them for things, the more they're going to sort of huddle together and cling to one another in a defensive posture. And so, that obviously these are very different phenomena externally, but internally, I think that we all have a need to belong, and in a society where we have a declining religiosity, it sounds like you don't come from a religious background just because your parents were more toward the left, but in a society that has declining religiosity, we're losing our sense of belonging to like a church or to a body of Christians, and people are grasping at straws trying to fill that void. And it's producing some very strange and perverse outcomes. So I guess I threw a lot out there. I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you say. And I don't know if you've read my article, Terror and Human Weirdness. But that adds another dimension to this theory. And that's an article about terror management theory. And it's about the way that fear of death shapes human behavior and culture. And the idea is that we can never really accept the fact of our own mortality. And so we seek immortality through social belonging, right? And of course, Christianity gives us a very sort of literal form of immortality, that we're going to live after death. Other types of social belonging do fulfill the same purpose, but in a more subtle manner, that we're going to belong and fight for this entity, which was the race, which was there long before us and will be around long after our death. And so we can participate in this eternal thing that is less mortal than we are. And also, if we're very excellent, we can achieve fame and even we say immortality, right? If you're a great writer, they say that person achieved immortality as a writer, right? And so and indeed, white nationalism is filled with its own kind of pagan religion, where someone once told me when I was running my racist websites, because of what you're doing, you will end up in Valhalla, right? You'll be one of these immortal warriors for your race and your people, right? And so I think it's not just about belonging, but about the desire to achieve a certain kind of immortality and deny death.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to disentangle those two phenomena, which is the fear of death and the desire to belong. From an evolutionary perspective, we probably desire to belong because, as a social species, if you don't belong, you're probably going to die. And even worse, you're not going to reproduce. So, for example, if you're a warrior and you have a wife and you have children, you go off and you die in battle, but you preserve your society, you preserve your tribe, your children will have grandchildren and great grandchildren. And so genetically, it is from an evolutionary perspective, from a selfish gene perspective, it is actually more scary to be socially excluded because it means you won't have a mate and it means your children won't have a mate, and you won't have reproductive success, versus going and dying in battle is actually, from the genetic perspective, more evolutionarily advantageous because it gives your offspring and your cousins and so on a better chance to survive. So I would say that, from my perspective, actually, both of these things are rooted in evolutionary biology, but I believe that for most people, the fear of social exclusion is greater than the fear of death. Not everybody. Some people, they don't need friends and they're just fine being on their own, and they're quite afraid of death. But I think most people, if you push them hard enough and with enough social pressure, they will go to war and they will sacrifice their lives. Now, it depends on the cause, right? We don't want to just go to war for no reason at all. But, I think the modern era has shown that you can get millions of men to get on a ship and go fight in a country they've never been before, because ultimately of social pressure and a desire to belong and participate, and nationalism and patriotism. So these are very deep psychological needs. I don't know how much further we want to delve into this topic, and I'm happy to keep going in this direction. I also wanted to check in with you on comparative literature, because I know that's what you got your PhD in, and wanted to check in and see, how has that influenced your perspective? What is your approach? I'm more of a comparative religion guy. I'm sort of like a Joseph Campbell based person, and so that's the lens through which I view comparative literature. But I wanted to hear your perspective, if that's still something that influences you to this day.
I've been thinking quite a lot about that, and less and less so. I think I did not choose my field wisely. I don't think that field really played to my strengths. And I've been thinking about how rarely I read literature these days, almost never. And I've been thinking about why that is, and I'll probably write about it. But briefly, I think that literature is kind of a delivery mechanism for psychological theories, right? They literary authors have theories about how the mind works, and for example, why many great literary artists portray people who are basically confused about the nature of reality. I don't know if you've read Pride and Prejudice, but that's about a young woman who, because of her emotions, misinterprets the world, right? And it's by Jane Austen, and if you go through it and you look at the psychology of this character named Elizabeth Bennet, you can see many contemporary psychological theories, such as the theory of self-enhancing biases. Have you ever read about those?
I'm fairly illiterate when it comes to psychology, so you'll have to explain.
Well, for whatever reason, human beings tend to be unrealistically optimistic about their future. They tend to have unrealistically positive views of themselves. So if you ask a bunch of people on a scale of 1 to 10, how good of a driver are you? You'll end up with an average of around 8. Whereas if they were rational, you'd end up with an average of 5, right? Because some people are really bad drivers, right? But no one thinks they are. And people also exaggerate the amount of control that they have over the world. They think they have more control than they actually do. And so, if I just blow on these dice, that'll make the number come out right for me, right? Um, and so, I think literary authors depict human psychology, and I think back in around the year 1800, when Jane Austen was writing these novels, psychology wasn't really a thing yet, right? There weren't really any elaborated psychological theories, and so literature was people's way of absorbing psychological theories that were more subtle and interesting than what was available to them in nonfiction. And I think what's happened today is that with the development of the science of psychology, that gap is closed. And so, if you want to find out about an interesting psychological theory, you can just read a book by one of the many geniuses who work in that field. And so that's why I think I no longer read literature, and I read a lot of psychology and other social science. Um, so
That's interesting. I guess I'm a little more sympathetic to Jung and the old version of psychology, early 20th century, is because I do believe that the vast majority of people, as you indicated, have strong biases, motivated reasoning, and they have a distorted vision of themselves. And it's very difficult oftentimes to take a depressed person, and maybe you're a fan of CBT or neurolinguistic programming, and you think there's some good results out of that. But even getting people to the therapist sometimes is difficult. Even if, as you argue, you say, well, we have these books and they explain it, and if you just read the book, you figure it out. Some people aren't very intelligent. Some people are highly resistant to even picking up the book and trying to help themselves. And I think most people, we can sort of externally wish that they would go to the therapist, or they would read the book, or they would exercise and diet and all these helpful things that are scientifically proven to alleviate these symptoms. But a lot of people don't even want to try. They don't even want to take this first step. And a lot of people engage in self-destructive behaviors. So in the same way that we're talking about the fact that many people engage in self-deception with regard to ideology in a negative sense, that is, they say, I want to be loved, but I can't admit that, and so I'm going to become a white nationalist or something, which is highly convoluted and doesn't really work, but we can see how it's rooted in that attempt. In the same way, I would say from the opposite perspective, a lot of times you sort of have to trick people into wanting to help themselves, because directly speaking, a lot of people have a lot of emotional resistance. For instance, they have a guilt complex. They think, I deserve to feel bad. I deserve or they have a spite complex, a resentment complex. Well, it's more important for me to get revenge than it is for me to be happy. It's more important, my parents messed me up, and so I hate my parents, even if that's not going to help me whatsoever, to ritualistically blame my parents for everything. So I'm kind of sympathetic to Jung in this idea that you can't directly solve most people's problems by hitting them consciously with facts and logic. There are some people who are sympathetic to that, and most of those people tend to be, atheists, socially liberal types. But for the vast majority of people, you sort of have to trick them using allegories and metaphors and imagery, and I think that is the traditional function of religion, is maybe to sort of esoterically sneak in psychological solutions to psychological problems, but to do that through it's almost like sugarcoating the pill. Like, people aren't able to directly confront their problems in a logical way, and so what you do is you tell them a story about God and heroes and myths and legends or literature, and that literature actually helps them, those metaphors help them address those problems in a way that's not as scary as like directly confronting them, but ultimately provide the same sort of psychological support that people need. So that would be my kind of defense of why I think mythology, in especially now that we have declining religiousness, we have more political mythology than we have like ancient mythology and religious mythology. But I still think people are not going to directly confront their problems. So we're going to continue to see these grand sweeping narratives on politics that are a result of people trying to solve personal problems. And we can object to that as unscientific or ignorant or misinformed or whatever. But I think you're a testament to the fact that very intelligent people actually operate like very intelligent people, rather than directly confront their problems, will adopt grand sweeping narratives and mythologies and attempt to like slay the dragon in the political realm rather than do it in a personal realm.
You remind me of some research that was done on social identity and group belonging, where you would expect the smarter people to be more open-minded about views that challenge their own, and the truth is exactly the opposite. The smarter you are, the more closed-minded you are, because the better you are at finding ways of defending your bullshit, right? Um, there is no right or wrong, but thinking makes it so. I think that's Hamlet, right? The smarter you are, the better you can defend completely irrational beliefs.
Yeah, so I guess this is, I would like it if everybody could simply, read the book and figure things out. But I guess where I'm bringing this to is the belief that if you truly want to undermine racism, white supremacy, you have to use some sort of mythological means. You have to replace it with a different grand narrative. You have to give people a different sense of belonging. Simply telling people that they're technically wrong, and here's a study, and go read Sasha Gusev. I could, what's that movie? A Clockwork Orange. I could strap a racist down, peel their eyeballs open, and say, here, read this, we're going to 24/7, project this into your brain. And all it would do would make them kind of annoyed and frustrated. I don't think that would convince the majority of them. So I think by saying, we understand you have a need for love and belonging, and this desire for immortality, and this desire for approval or fame, and all these different things, we want to give you a mechanism or a story of how you can reach for the stars. You can get those things that you need, or at least attempt to. Here's this quest that you're on. And I find oftentimes there's an approach that says, well, just care about your own personal life, or, we have this movement now that's about longevity. So like, you should optimize your health to live as long as possible, and so on. Or, you should optimize your finances, and you should, everything's about optimizing life. But people don't want to optimize their lives. They want to be part of a risky, dangerous quest to save the world, where they might have to sacrifice themselves. It's a deep human desire for heroism. So I think if we really want to address race realism, the best way to do that isn't by showing them a study by Sasha Gusev. Maybe a certain percentage of people will be convinced by that. But I think actually a stronger and more practical method would be to say, here's a new religion, here's a new mythology, here's something that can give you something to sink your teeth in. Here's a positive alternative. And the problem I see oftentimes is that that's either not provided, or sometimes when it is provided, it tends to devolve into an inversion of white supremacy, where the world would be perfect if only white people didn't exist. Well, that's not true either, and it's not a very productive belief. So I guess that's my criticism, not directly of the science of Sasha Gusev, but of the approach. And it's kind of what I'm also trying to tell race realists is that your IQ stats and your science that you believe is true also is not sufficient to solve even if you take those presumptions to be true, they're not actually going to solve the deep cultural, mythological, spiritual, religious problems in our society, which are much bigger than things like the crime rate or the budget or something like that.
Well, I hear what you're saying. I have a lot more belief in science than you do, and of course, I think it I think it does take people like Sasha Gusev and um, Eric Turkheimer and many excellent geneticists that we have these days, but it also takes people who perhaps have different interests, but who are informed about the realities as science sees them now, and can work that into um, whatever ideology or philosophy they're promoting. And just as far as I wanted to say something about therapy. That the thing is that I was did have these quite serious mental health issues, and I had been in therapy a lot. I was in therapy um, back in college, and then shortly after I gave up the white nationalism, I felt the need to get into therapy. It didn't do me a lot of good, right? Um, because I was just presenting my self image to these therapists. What did me good was a therapist who was a clinical psychologist and dealt with me scientifically, right? Giving me personality questionnaires, right? Um, like asking me questions about, for example, whether I often misrecognized objects, right? Whether it's a tree, but I see it's a tree bough, but do you see an arm a lot, right? And and diagnosing me according to these questionnaires. Um, and so where it really wasn't about um, you and the therapist becoming friends, but it was much more like a doctor diagnosing your cough or something, right? And I think that the science of psychotherapy is has a lot of problems, a lot of conceptual issues, and I don't think if you read my last essay on C.A. Soper, what did I call it? What if mental illnesses aren't illnesses? That was my last essay. You'll see C.A. Soper, like a lot of professional psychologists, no longer believe in um, categories like schizophrenia or depression. They think it's that these mental illnesses have a different logic entirely. But that I do think that science is often the answer, and it is often what will help us. Because that clinical psychologist convinced me that I had a serious personality disorder. I had been my whole way of dealing with people was crazy, and I thought about that for a while, and it's like, yeah, maybe that's true. Um, also, drugs are really useful as well. So I guess we have kind of different perspectives on these issues. Um, but I hear what you're saying, and I do agree with your what I take to be what you're saying, that we need a big heroic story which is less toxic than racism, right?
Yeah, I guess I agree with you that I believe that science is helpful. I mean, it has demonstrated value. It can solve problems. So I'm not doubting the efficacy of science in itself. What I'm doubtful of is the ability of science to convince people. I mean, just look at climate change, look at vaccine skepticism. We're not even getting into the racial issue, but just think of how many issues there are where large swaths of people um, do not trust science. They don't want to go to a therapist. They don't want to talk to a shrink. And that distrust has been around for a long time. whether it's getting better or worse, I guess, is a different conversation. But I'm just saying there's a large percentage of people who you could say, hey, look, here's a study that shows that this form of therapy is the best way to solve your problems. And they'll say, oh, what did the Jews tell you to say that? Oh, Bill Gates sent you, and blah blah. You're with the WEF. You're a globalist like them. So people are so resistant to science in itself that I think I'm not saying we need less science or we should ignore it or defund it, but I'm saying that in addition to the science, that, like, I'm not a scientific person in the sense I don't have mathematical skills. I'm never going to conduct a quantitative study of anything, but I see my function as okay, I can't do direct science. But what I can do is I can talk to people and I can try to convince them that there are things that they should be optimistic and hopeful about, and they don't need to dig into resentment and defend themselves against, racial genocide and those sorts of narratives. That there's an alternative story. So I think of myself in a sense as a storyteller. I'm trying to tell true stories, but they're also metaphorical. They're mythological, and I'm aware of how that affects people. And I think as much as we've discussed the way it can negatively affect people by telling harmful stories, I think it's also possible to tell productive, pro-social, good stories. So that's kind of my focus. But I don't think it's that science is wrong and the mythological approach is correct, but that they both have different domains and different functions. They're going to reach different people. So it's kind of a full spectrum approach rather than saying, one is better than the other. There's different personalities. We all have a place. But I do want to acknowledge you said you only had an hour. We're coming to the end of the hour. I want to give you the last word. Of course, tell us what you're working on. Anyone you want to promote, tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, as far as people I want to promote, well, I mean, you can read my articles. I promote various people on there. I wish you luck in forming your new narrative that will help people be less toxic. And as far as what I'm working on, I am going to go back to the study of literature in an article that I think I'll publish tomorrow about examining what's a real mystery to me. Literature departments are kind of hemorrhaging these days. They're losing students, right? People increasingly don't want to be English majors, and they don't want literature PhDs aren't getting hired. Funding's getting cut, and even while it happens, scientists, psychologists are doing research that proves that reading literature has a really valuable educational function that improves our social understandings, and improves our critical thinking, and yet literature professors just ignore it all, right? They completely they don't want to engage with science, and I think that's so destructive. And my next article is going to be about that.
Excellent. Well, we will look forward to it. We're pretty much ending right on the dot here. I will link to your Substack where people can find you, read your articles, and we'll look forward to hearing what you have to say. I appreciate you coming on. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Let's end this call. And that is the recording. If you guys like that one, I'm sure some people will love it, some people will hate it, but if you like it, you got to comment, subscribe, like the post, share it on Twitter, do all of the things that count as engagement, because the more engagement it gets, the more feedback I get from you on what's good and what's not good. I think that I thought it was very good. I'm someone who I'm not qualified to speak on what Sasha Gusev gets wrong and what he gets right. I'm basically, I've spoken with the hereditarians on this one, and I'm sympathetic to anyone who is doing research in social science, whether they're coming at it and saying, here's a study that disproves hereditarianism, or here's a study that proves it's real. I think that we shouldn't be stuck in the bell curve paradigm. I think a lot has changed, actually. I think our knowledge of genetics, I think really everything has to be updated. So anyone who's working in a paradigm where they say, well, every bell curve already figured everything out, why do we need to continue the discussion? No, I think criticism is good. I think we should continue, social sciences should continue to debate this issue, and the more openly they can debate it, and the more people listen to both sides, I think the closer to the truth we're actually going to get. But of course, there's a moral hazard on both sides, which is that people don't really want to listen to each other. They don't want to talk to each other. They want to view the other side as evil, and it's impossible to turn off that emotional part of the brain and just consider the arguments logically. But I do encourage people, obviously. I don't expect every individual to do that. I mean, I think Ian is a person who's demonstrated his ability to change his mind, and so I think what he has to say is valuable and worth checking out. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm kind of in a weird position. Maybe people don't know what to make of it. People are like, what are you doing? Why are you talking to both sides? You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to talk to both sides. We have to hate each other and want to hurt each other. But I don't want to hurt people on either side. I actually do want us to come together as Americans and see that race is not something that should divide us, in the sense that we should not blame white supremacy for everything bad in the world. We should not blame black people for everything bad in the world. And there's actually a bigger issue at play that race alone is not capable of solving. So I would say I'm trying to deconstruct the issue as best as possible, and see that maybe there's something bigger than race. For a lot of people on the left and a lot of people on the right, they are not able to see that. They're not able to say, well, I disagree with your position on race, but we're both Americans. We both have common ground. That seems to be disappearing. That seems to be untenable. So maybe this is a fool's errand. Maybe I'm just totally wasting my time in trying to have conversations with people. But anyway, that's my attempt. If you guys appreciate it, you can pay me $9 a month and support me that way. This is a full-time job. I have to scour the internet and find people and interview them and do all the things. So it's a full-time job. In addition to, I'm writing 8,000 word articles and doing crazy. I can't believe you people read the articles. I stay up all night writing this article, and then I plug it into the Word, because Substack doesn't have an automatic word counter. So I copy paste into the word counter. I'm like, oh my gosh, 8,000 words. I'm like, well, I've already spent my entire day on this. Do I really want to spend another entire day editing this down and making it perfect? Because you never know what people are going to like. Maybe I could write the perfect article, but it's about a topic that's completely irrelevant to the interests of my audience, and therefore it's not going to get any play at all. Versus I could write a short, choppy, kind of badly written article about something people are really interested in with a really good title, and the right person restacks it, and then that goes viral. So in terms of productivity, viewing it as a business, trying to maximize exposure, investing hundreds of hours into a single article is not, doesn't have a lot of instant gratification, doesn't have, there's not a lot of ROI. So I just said 8,000 words. It is what it is. I hit publish, and people actually liked it. So I was surprised. I basically gave up. I was like, okay, this is silly, but people liked it. People read it. People took the time. So I really appreciate your time. If you've made it through this hour, I know a lot of you are going to disagree with some of the things that were said. Other people say I don't go far enough, and whatever. Everyone's mad at me, and that's part of the thing. I'm a contrarian. If you're not getting mad, I'm not doing my job. Maybe it's just a form of entertainment, but I hope that being exposed to contradictory positions is stimulating, makes you think, and I don't know, makes us realize that life is not just memes on Twitter. It's not just people hating each other, but there is a way to transcend that. There is something beyond that. And that transcendent idea is what I'm going for. So with that, I will bid you adieu. Thank you, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.